Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the adventures of Philip Marlowe, brought to you by your friends at Metropolitan Insurance. Tonight's story, Desert Winds. The name is Marlowe, Philip Marlowe. I'm a private investigator in this city of angels, where the palm trees sway and the dreams sometimes turn into nightmares. It was one of those October nights when the desert winds were blowing hot and dry through canyons, making everybody's nerves jump like live wires. The kind of night when you can smell trouble in the air, mixed with jasmine and automobile exhaust. I was sitting in my office on the 7th floor of the Cahenga building, feet up on the desk, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold about an hour ago. The wind was rattling the Venetian blinds like skeleton fingers, and I was thinking about calling it a night when she walked in. They always walk in on nights like this, the kind of dame who spells trouble in capital letters. She was tall, maybe 5'7" in her stocking feet, with auburn hair that caught the light from my desk lamp like copper wire. Her green dress probably cost more than I make in a month, and her eyes were the color of the Pacific on a stormy day. But it wasn't her looks that got my attention. It was the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, like she expected someone to follow her through that door. "Mr. Marlowe?" Her voice was smoky, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. "I need your help." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "That's what the sign on the door says, lady. Have a seat and tell me what's eating you." She sat down, crossing her legs and fumbling with a small beaded purse. "My name is Victoria Sterling. Perhaps you've heard of my husband, Jonathan Sterling, the real estate developer?" I'd heard of him, all right. Sterling was one of those men who bought up half of Los Angeles and sold it back to the other half at twice the price. He had his fingers in everything, from downtown office buildings to beachfront hotels. The kind of man who collected enemies like other people collected stamps. "I know the name," I said, lighting up a cigarette. "What's the problem, Mrs. Sterling?" She took a deep breath, and I could see her hands trembling slightly. "Someone is trying to eliminate my husband, Mr. Marlowe. 3 days ago, his car brakes failed on Mulholland Drive. Yesterday, a construction beam nearly fell on him at one of his building sites. And tonight—" She paused, reaching into her purse and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Tonight, this was slipped under our door." I took the note and read it under my desk lamp. The message was short and to the point. "The third time pays for all. Tomorrow night, when the desert winds blow, your debts will be settled." It was typed on expensive stationery, the kind you'd find in the better hotel gift shops. "Any idea who might want to hurt your husband, Mrs. Sterling?" She laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. "In Jonathan's line of work, Mr. Marlowe, that's a very long list. He's foreclosed on dozens of properties, forced out small businesses to make way for his developments. But this feels different, more personal." I stubbed out my cigarette and leaned back in my chair. The wind outside was getting stronger, and I could hear a loose shutter banging somewhere in the building. "What does your husband think about all this?" "That's just it. He doesn't know about the note. He thinks the other incidents were just accidents. Jonathan can be very stubborn about admitting he's in danger. He's attending a business dinner tomorrow night at the Ocean View Club. I'm terrified something will happen to him there." I quoted her my daily rate plus expenses, and she didn't even blink. She opened that beaded purse and counted out 5 $20 bills onto my desk, enough to cover 3 days' work. In my business, you learn to spot the clients who can pay and the ones who'll skip town before the bill comes due. Mrs. Sterling was definitely in the first category. "I'll need a list of your husband's business associates and anyone who might have a grudge," I said, pocketing the money. "And I want to take a look around your house, see if I can find any clues about who delivered that note." The Sterling house was in Hancock Park, one of those Spanish colonial mansions with more rooms than most people have furniture, Mrs. Sterling led me through halls lined with oil paintings and Persian rugs, the kind of place where you're afraid to touch anything because it probably costs more than your car.
"Jonathan's study is in here," she said, opening a heavy wooden door. "He keeps all his business papers in that desk." The study was impressive. Leather-bound books, a massive oak desk, and a wall safe that looked like it could stop a tank shell. But it was the window that caught my attention. It faced the back garden, and the lock had been jimmied recently. Whoever had delivered that note hadn't used the front door. I spent an hour going through Sterling's papers, and what I found painted a picture of a man who played hardball in a city where hardball could get you eliminated permanently. There were angry letters from displaced tenants, legal threats from business rivals, and a particularly nasty exchange with a man named Eddie Torino, who claimed Sterling had cheated him out of a waterfront development deal. "Eddie Torino," I said to Mrs. Sterling. "Tell me about him." Her face went pale. "He used to be Jonathan's partner years ago. They had a falling out over some property in Santa Monica. Eddie claimed Jonathan forged his signature on some documents, cut him out of a very profitable deal. But that was 5 years ago. 5 years is a long time to hold a grudge, but in this town, I'd seen people wait longer for revenge. Torino had a reputation as a man who didn't forget and didn't forgive. If he was behind these attempts on Sterling's life, tomorrow night's business dinner could turn into a funeral." I called a contact at the police department, Detective Ray Pinker, and asked him to run a check on Eddie Torino. What he told me wasn't encouraging. Torino had been arrested twice in the past year on suspicion of arson, both times involving properties that later went up for development. No convictions, but enough smoke to suggest fire. "He's got an alibi for both incidents with your Mr. Sterling," Pinker told me. "But alibis can be bought in this town for the price of a good dinner." The next evening I stationed myself outside the Ocean View Club, a ritzy establishment where the city's power players went to make deals over martinis and prime rib. The desert winds were still blowing, stirring up dust and making the palm trees dance like grass skirts. I had a clear view of the entrance in the parking lot, and I'd already checked the kitchen and service entrances for any suspicious characters. Sterling arrived at 7:30 sharp, driving a brand-new Cadillac that probably cost more than most people's houses. He was a big man, maybe 6'2", with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from owning half a city. He walked into the club like he owned that too, which he probably did. I waited. In my line of work, you do a lot of waiting. You wait for the suspect to make a move, wait for the evidence to surface, wait for the truth to show itself. But tonight felt different. The wind was carrying something besides dust and the smell of distant fires. It was carrying the scent of danger. At 9:15, I spotted him. Eddie Torino was walking across the parking lot, but he wasn't alone. He had 2 companions, both wearing dark suits and the kind of bulges under their jackets that meant business. They weren't going in through the front door. They were heading for the service entrance I'd checked earlier. I followed them, keeping to the shadows between the parked cars. The service door led to the kitchen, and from there it was a short walk to the main dining room where Sterling was probably enjoying his second scotch and making plans to tear down another piece of old Los Angeles. The kitchen was busy with the usual dinner rush, waiters rushing back and forth, cooks shouting orders, steam rising from a dozen pots and pans. It was the perfect cover for 3 men who didn't belong there. I watched Torino point toward the dining room and say something to his companions. One of them nodded and reached inside his jacket. That's when I decided to crash the party. "Police, nobody move!" It wasn't exactly true, I'm not a cop, but it had the desired effect. The kitchen staff hit the floor, and Torino's men spun around with their hands reaching for hardware. I already had my .38 out and pointed in their direction. "Easy, boys. The only thing that needs to happen here is a nice quiet conversation between Mr. Torino and me." Torino was sweating despite the air conditioning.
"He destroyed my life," he said. "He stole everything I worked for." "Maybe he did," I said, keeping my gun steady. "But planning to settle it with violence isn't going to bring back what you lost. It's just going to land you in the electric chair." For a moment, I thought he might listen to reason. Then the desert wind rattled the windows, and something in his eyes went hard as concrete. "Some debts can only be paid one way," he said. The bullet went wide, shattering a window behind me. I didn't have a choice. I put 2 shots center mass, and Torino went down like a sack of cement. His companions decided they didn't want any part of a gunfight and headed for the exit at a dead run. By the time the police arrived, it was all over except for the paperwork. Torino was still breathing, but he'd be spending the next 10 to 20 years thinking about the mistakes that led him to that kitchen floor. Sterling came out to thank me personally, and Mrs. Sterling cried a little, which made me feel like I had actually accomplished something worthwhile. The desert winds finally stopped blowing around midnight, and the city settled into its usual restless sleep. I drove back to my office through empty streets, thinking about justice and revenge and the thin line that separates them. In this city of angels, sometimes the only thing standing between order and chaos is a private detective with a .38 and a willingness to use it. Another case closed. Another night in Los Angeles where the good guys won and the bad guys learned that crime doesn't pay. At least not on my watch. This has been The Adventures of Philip Marlowe. Tune in next week for another thrilling mystery from the city where dreams come true and nightmares walk the streets. Good night, everyone. And remember, in a world full of shadows, sometimes all it takes is one man willing to shine a light into the darkness.